Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales from This Side of Nowhere. I'm your host, Connor Jones, and I'm bringing you another story from just about as close as you can get to the middle of nowhere. That is Poverty Flats, Wyoming. Before we get started, though, here is a message from our sponsor. This week's episode is sponsored by Basins Market, located in Basin, Wyoming. Basins Market is your destination for groceries, fresh produce, and the best meat department in the Bighorn Basin. Come on in and sample their wide selection of products Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Sundays from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. We are also sponsored by the Wyoming Welcome Program. The Wyoming Welcome Program offers two services to local businesses: Table Talk and the Wyoming Welcome Baskets. Wyoming Welcome Baskets are filled with promotional items for local businesses and distributed to new move-ins to the Bighorn Basin. Table Talk brochures include jokes, facts about the state of Wyoming, the month's holidays, and advertisements from our local businesses. These brochures are placed on restaurant tables in Cody and Powell for diners to peruse. So if you'd like to get your business name out there, please contact the folks at the Wyoming Welcome Program by shooting an email to Haley J, that's HALEYJ, at wyomingwelcome.com. And now, the podcast. It has been a whirlwind of a week. Make that a couple weeks. Last weekend, my dad and I went elk hunting in the Bighorns, and I saw a bull, but I have a cow tag, and we stayed over on the north side of the canyon all day and saw some sign. There was snow on the ground, but in the evening, nothing came out, and so we trekked back to the pickup about 7:30 at night or so, and we had driven my dad's truck down into the canyon, and with the snow, it was just so slick, we couldn't back it out, and ended up getting it stuck, and I tried to pull it out with my truck, and it just got worse, and long story short, we ended up spending an extra night on the mountain, and Sunday, we had an ox in the mire and ended up pulling out Dad's truck with the help of some logging cables and a pulley. So we were able to get a pulley right behind the truck and line up my pickup to pull Dad's truck straight backwards. And I didn't get home on Sunday till about 6:30. So Haley and the boys luckily were in Montana, so they weren't at home missing me, but it was a crazy weekend. And then, lo and behold, the stomach flu struck. First, William, the baby, got the stomach flu. Then Haley got the stomach flu Wednesday. And Ruben got it yesterday afternoon. And then yesterday evening, I got it. So it was a long night, and with everything going on, I didn't record this podcast until right now. It's Saturday morning, and it's almost 7 a.m. So if you're someone who likes to catch the podcast early on Saturday, I apologize. This is not coming out until later in the morning. But it is coming out. So it's probably the first time in a couple years that I've had a delayed release. But it's probably more of a miracle that it doesn't happen more often. Anyways, we're going to continue with this story, West Meets South. If you remember, we were, Lily, Fred, Sarah, and Al all went on vacation to South Carolina. And when I left them off, Lily and Al were on the beach watching the waves and taking in the view, and it was perfect. Now here is part 2. At 5:30 the next morning, Fred and I were up, ready to try our hand at saltwater fishing. 2 country boys who grew up 1,000 miles from the closest ocean. It was still dark when we pulled up in front of Rita's Seaside Grill on Folly Beach. "Looks like we got the best parking spot," Fred said, happily parking the Corolla in front of the restaurant. "And this one is free, too." We climbed out of the car and opened the trunk to reveal our rods and the fishing tackle we had picked out at Walmart the night before. Based on our research, we had opted for a dropper rig and frozen shrimp for bait. "Geez, I can't get over how big these weights are," Fred commented, hefting one of the 2-ounce pyramid-shaped weights. "Yeah," I agreed. "I've caught fish that weighed less than this thing." Anyone watching probably would have wondered if the 2 grown men laughing in the dark behind a Corolla with a couple of fishing rods and headlamps were entirely crazy. Excitedly, we scooped up our gear and crossed the street, intent on reaching the water as soon as possible. I couldn't help it. I was as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. We were actually here, at the ocean, and we were going fishing for saltwater fish. When we reached the pier, rather than going up the stairs, we went around them and out onto the sand. To the east, the horizon was just starting to turn gray, and the roar of the surf hitting the pier filled the morning air, which, surprisingly, was not cold in the least. That was one of the things that amazed me about South Carolina. It was hot and muggy, even at 6 in the morning in September. "Let's cast beside the pier," I suggested, and we crossed under the huge wooden structure, our headlamp beams illuminating the concrete footers that jutted up out of the sand. I dropped the Walmart paper bag containing our extra tackle and bait about 50 yards from the water's edge and crouched down to fish a frozen shrimp out of the bag. "I've got these shrimp lures too," Fred said, holding up a plastic bag with colorful shrimp-shaped lures. "I think I'll put on one of these and an actual shrimp, too." Our rods now loaded up with bait, we waded out to the water's edge. Fred drew back with his rod like an Olympic hammer thrower, preparing to fling his implement, and heaved the line out in front of him. His little Zebco reel squealed in protest. I stood behind him and marveled at the weight of just the fishing rig, without any fish. My pole bent as I prepared to cast. With a quick movement of both arms, I flung everything forward and let go of the button on my reel. My tackle sailed up into the darkness. When I judged it must have had sufficient time to land on the ocean floor, I pulled back and set the reel, but found to my dismay that the line wasn't down in front of me, but rather up in front of me. "Oh no," I gasped. "What?" Fred asked from beside me. "I think I've cast into the pier," I groaned. "Wait, what?" Fred asked, breaking into an enormous grin. "I did," I said in disbelief, giving my line a tug. "It's up on the pier." "Oh my gosh, leave it to the kid from Wyoming to cast and miss the entire ocean," Fred chuckled. "I think I can get it back," I said, following my flashlight beam up to the edge of the pier, which was now growing more and more visible in the early morning light. "Might you hold my pole?" I asked, handing it to Fred. "Sure," he replied, now holding 2 fishing rods. I crunched back across the sand the way we had come, and then up the steps to the pier. It was now after 6 o'clock, and the glass double doors that led out onto the pier were unlocked when I pushed on the one to the right. My flip-flops, also purchased at Walmart the night before, slapped on wood planks as I strode out onto the pier. There were just a few people present, I noted with relief. I didn't exactly want to be seen searching for my line up here on the pier. I glanced down to my left and could see Fred's headlamp glowing. The horizon to the east was just starting to color, and I could make out the edges of the pier without the aid of my flashlight beam. Continuing a dozen paces more, I reached a wooden beach chair, and, checking to my left, saw that I was in about the right place. I leaned over the edge of the railing and could see my line glinting in the light of my headlamp. I grabbed it, then followed it forward, and couldn't help but laugh. My bait was dangling from the back of the chair, and the weight was lodged between the boards in the chair's back. Relieved, and perhaps a little chagrined, I looked around to ensure no one was watching, and pulled the weight out of the chair. Nonchalantly, I tossed it over the side of the pier and into the water, being careful not to snag the twin hooks on anything as I did so. I turned my headlamp off as I turned and walked back down the pier at a brisk pace, eager to try again. There was no way I could do worse on my second cast. "It was stuck in a chair," I called down to Fred when I drew even with him, momentarily forgetting my desire to avoid calling attention to my hair. "No kidding," he shouted back with a laugh. I shook my head and continued down the pier. Back at the water's edge, I accepted my pole and made another cast, being extra careful to avoid any piers, buildings, or surfers, who had begun to appear on the water's edge. As Fred and I watched, at least a dozen surfers appeared seemingly out of nowhere and began paddling their boards out into the waves. The sun was peeking out from behind the clouds in the east, and we slipped our lights into the pockets on our fishing vests, which I noticed no one up on the pier was wearing. I guess when you can sit and fish, you don't really need a vest to carry around your tackle. We had been fishing for nearly a half hour when it happened. "Whoa!" I yelled. "I think I've got something." "No," Fred yawned. "That's just the ocean messing with your rig." I furrowed my brow and looked at the tip of my rod, which was bobbing in time to the waves. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Nearly everything about fishing in the ocean was new to me. The sights, the sounds, even the smell of the salty air. I marveled at how the waves could bend the pole. In Wyoming's waterways, a tug like that meant you had caught something of considerable size. "Smile, dude," Fred said, holding up his phone to take a picture. "We're fishing. In the ocean." I grinned. Fred's teeth flashed white behind his beard, and I felt a little shiver of happiness. It was so good to be here, Fred and I, fishing and watching the sunrise. "Thanks for inviting us," I said as Fred deposited the phone in a pocket on his vest. "Thanks for coming, man," Fred replied happily. "Hey," I gasped, "I think I've actually got something." I started to reel furiously, feeling the weight on the end of my line. "Really?" Fred asked dubiously. "Oh yeah," I yelled, my excitement growing. This was definitely a fish. It had to be. "It's moving," I yelled. "I've got a fish!" I wonder what any of the South Carolina natives would have said if they had been watching as Fred and I cheered like a couple of schoolboys, jumping up and down on the sand. I reeled furiously and started watching for my catch to emerge from the surf. It wasn't anything huge, judging by the amount of resistance I was feeling, but it was definitely a fish. After a few minutes, the line popped back toward me, and something fishy splashed up onto the sand in front of us. I ran forward, holding my rod up in the air behind me to keep some tension on the line, and crouched down. Sure enough, it was definitely a fish. "Look at that! It's a fish!" I hollered above the sound of the crashing surf. "Yes, it is! Let me get a picture," Fred shouted. I gripped the fish in both hands and took a closer look. It was silvery, with sharp spiny fins and a sail running down its back. It was also very determined not to hold still for a quick photo. "Whoops," I laughed as it wriggled out of my hands and swung around on the end of the line. Fred grabbed at it and had it just about under control when I went to take it from him, and it slithered out of his hands too. "Oh, come on," he grumbled. Finally getting a finger hooked under one of its gills, I held the fish and was able to get a better look. "Geez, something tried to eat this guy while I was reeling him in," I observed. There on the tail of my fish was a red arc of teeth marks where something big had tried to take a bite out of my fish. "Look at that," Fred laughed in disbelief. "There are big fish out here." The fish was at most 9 inches long, but whatever had tried to eat it had to have been far larger. A shiver of excitement ran through me as I removed the hook from the fish's mouth and tossed it back into the water. "Well, we can say we've caught a fish in the ocean," I cheered. Fred nodded. "Yeah, it's pretty awesome." It was now daylight, and people were emerging onto the beach. The crowd of surfers had grown, and now nearly 24 of them bobbed on the waves on the east side of the pier. "Excuse me," a voice came from behind us. We turned to see a lady in her mid-40s in blue pants, a white shirt, and tennis shoes addressing us. "It looks like your stuff is getting wet. Would you like me to move it back up the beach for you?" Oh, I said, taken aback. Sure. Thank you so much." It was true. The tide was lapping around the brown paper Walmart sack we were using for our extra tackle and bait. The woman picked up the bag and moved it about 10 feet farther up the beach, away from the water, and gave us a friendly wave before continuing on her way. "Y'all have a blessed day," she said as she walked away down the beach. "Well, that was kind of her," Fred said. "Yes, it was," I agreed. "People are so nice here." Fred wound up for another cast, the weight and 2 lures bouncing behind him on the sand, before he flung the whole thing forward. The big lead pyramid and its accompanying hardware soared in a long arc out over the waves, then disappeared, sailing off into the water. Unfortunately, the rest of Fred's line did not follow it. Instead, a long bit of line fluttered in the morning breeze where it should have been taut with the weight of the fishing rig. "Oh no," he gasped. "My line snapped. The reel is just not set up for fishing with stuff this big. Even if I caught a fish, I wouldn't be able to reel it in," he lamented. "I need a bigger reel." "Well, it's about 7:45, I observed. "We should probably head back now anyway. Maybe we can stop by Walmart and get you a bigger reel." "Ha ha," Fred laughed. "Let's do it." I brought my line in, and we crunched our way through the sand, back toward the street, snagging our bag of supplies on our way past. For my part, I was still riding my high, flush with the excitement of having actually caught a fish in the Atlantic Ocean. I couldn't wait to tell Lily. It was about 8:15 when we made it back to the Airbnb, and neither of the women were up and about. Fred carried his purchases into his room, and I went in to see if Lily was awake. She looked groggy as I opened the door, but she asked, "How'd it go? Did you catch anything?" "Yes," I said excitedly. "It wasn't too big, but it was a fish. We're pretty sure it was an Atlantic croaker. It was only about 9 inches long." "Well, good. I'm glad you caught something," Lily said with a yawn. "Fred and I will get some breakfast going," I said. "Okay, I'll be out in a bit," Lily nodded. After breakfast, we headed for the Fort Sumter Visitor Center at Liberty Square. It was a warm day, already in the mid-70s. As we wove through traffic in downtown Charleston, I marveled at all the old buildings. "There's St. Philip's," Fred said, indicating the towering spire of a tan stone church ahead of us. At a stoplight, we watched as women in bright sundresses and men in polos and khaki shorts crossed the street. Colonial Charleston's single houses lined the streets, their open porches, or piazzas, dotted with wicker chairs and brightly colored rugs. "We're almost there," Fred said. "Let's start looking for a parking spot." We managed to find a public lot that advertised 2-hour parking. "I think 2 hours will be enough," Fred said as we exited the car. After cutting through an alleyway, we found ourselves strolling down a sidewalk in the warm morning air. The street was wider here as we approached Liberty Square. Here and there the sidewalks were pushed up by the roots of a tree. It was humid, and I knew if we walked for any length of time, I would soon be dripping with sweat. In fact, if we stood or sat outside, I was sure to be sweating. "That house has seen better days," I commented. "Yeah, it looks like it could fall down at any minute," Lily agreed. "Looks like it's a historical building," Fred observed, pointing to a plaque on the side of the building. "Charleston law doesn't allow any historical buildings to be removed, so they must be renovating this one." We passed an open field with rows of parked cars, and then we could see the large wrought iron gates of Liberty Square. "That must be it," Sarah said, pointing to the metal lettering on the fence. "Yes," Fred agreed. "The aquarium is over there, and the Fort Sumter Visitor Center and ferry are straight ahead." We entered the square and walked past a pavilion with rows of benches. Signs with black and white photos of people from the Civil War era were displayed on the columns of the pavilion, and the visitor center rose ahead of us. It was a 2-story brick building, and the line for the ferry was at the back. The ferry didn't leave for a half hour, but there were already several people in line ahead of us. They ranged in age from senior citizens in button-down shirts and white shorts to school-age children. We took our place in line on the water's edge with the ferry tied off to the wharf ahead of us. "Look," Fred said, pointing north. "There's the Ravenel Bridge." We turned to look and saw an enormous white cable-stayed suspension bridge with 2 towers and cables fanning out from them. It gleamed in the morning light, and the tiny dots of hundreds of vehicles marched across it. "That's beautiful," Lily said. While we waited, we saw no less than 2 dolphins jumping, and by the time the ferry employees welcomed us aboard, there were close to 200 people queued up to get on the boat. "It's a good thing we got here early," Fred observed. We took a place on the upper deck under a shade canopy and white plastic chairs where we could see the bay. The trip took about a half hour, and while we were cruising along, a park ranger regaled us with the history of Fort Sumter and its role in the Civil War. "The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter," the ranger said, spreading her hands wide. "The fort was ultimately destroyed when Union forces took control of Fort Johnson on James Island during a 587-day siege," the park ranger informed us. "There's Castle Pinckney," Fred told me, pointing to a little spit of land with a large stone structure rising from the water. "It was a fort during the Civil War, too." When the ferry docked at Fort Sumter, we joined the other tourists who streamed down the long wooden pier to the island itself. The walls of the fort rose 10 or 12 feet above the island, and they were weather-beaten and cracked. Huge gun ports were spaced evenly along the walls, and as we approached, we could see massive black cannons spread throughout the fort. Inside the walls, a concrete building and stairs led up to the side of the fort facing out toward the harbor, and a massive flagpole stood at the highest point of the fort. We participated in a short flag-raising ceremony, and then wandered around the fort, pausing for a few pictures next to the guns. Off in the distance, we could see the skyline of downtown Charleston, and off to the east and west, we could see the shorelines of James and Sullivan Islands. As we strolled through the fort, I thought about the battles that had been fought here, and the ensuing war in which hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives. It was sobering to consider. When the time came to get back on the ferry, we joined the rest of the group and the boat cruised back to the visitors center, where we disembarked. "I hope we didn't get a parking ticket," Fred worried as we walked back across Liberty Square. "Oh yeah," I agreed. "We've been parked there for more than 2 hours." "Why don't you and Fred go ahead, and Sarah and I will wait here," Lily offered. "Okay, we'll pick you up here," Fred said, and we took off. "Man, I hate parking," Fred grumbled as we speed-walked across the street and back toward the lot where we left the car. We rushed past people strolling leisurely along the sidewalk and avoided a spot where a tree's roots had pushed it up. Back past the old building being propped up by timbers, and then through the alley, and we were standing beside our little Corolla. "Did we get a ticket?" I asked, surveying the windshield. "Doesn't look like it," Fred said, obviously relieved. Thank goodness. I breathed a sigh of relief and we climbed back into the car. "That's one thing I always miss about Wyoming when I travel," I said. "You never have to worry about parking." "You can say that again," Fred agreed. Well, there you go. That is part 2. So, next time, I will continue talking about the trip to South Carolina. There's lots ahead. We still visited a lot of the colonial houses and Boone Hall. So I didn't really anticipate this story would stretch into a 3-parter, but I think it's well worth the time. It was a lot of fun, and, it's interesting to see the differences between the South and the West, because the differences are many and rather large. But if you have ever traveled to South Carolina and cast your line onto the pier, I'd be interested to hear about it, or any ocean fishing stories that you may have. So if you have your own story, please tell me about it. You can comment on this post when the episode drops on Facebook, or you can email me at untoldtalesthepodcast@gmail.com. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it, since it makes it easier for our podcast to be found, and recommend the podcast to all your friends. We would love to share Untold Tales from this side of nowhere with lots more people. As always, I've really enjoyed sharing this story with you, and this has been another episode of Untold Tales from this side of nowhere, where we work twice as hard for half as much, and still find time for the important things, like fishing. See you next time, folks.